I'm Edward Funk, and this is podcast number 55, titled Loretta Young and her sister Sally Get into a Slap Fest. Now, Loretta Young and her two older sisters were all beauties, and all were acting in films as movies transitioned from silent to talking pictures. Loretta and Sally were leading ladies, and Pollyann somewhat, but more often as the contract player. Now, Sally's career was in descent. After the head of Paramount, that was B.P. Schulberg, demanded that she be his mistress. If she wanted to continue working at that studio, she had to comply. So she walked away. But we covered this dilemma in an earlier podcast. Now, after she walked away from her lucrative Paramount contract, she signed with FBO, that stood for Film Booking Office Studios. Shortly before that studio was renamed RKO, and that stood for Radio Keith Orpheum, which stood for the vaudeville circuit that was now being resuscitated as a movie theater circuit, our chain. Now, it was Sally who switched the FBO sign for the new RKO sign. The event was captured by studio photographers and released to the wire services. Now, even when she was at Paramount, she was one of those actresses really better known for publicity shots than her movie roles. Famed photographer John Inkstead later told Sally, "You were the Marilyn Monroe of the studio. Whenever they wanted to sell anything, they called you into the portrait gallery." Now, Sally described the roles she was playing at RKO. She said, I was either the typical leading lady or second lead interest. I was always playing someone with vim and vigor. Now, William LeBaron, who is the head of RKO, saw a lot of promise in Sally and provided her with various coaches. Now, Mr. LeBaron cast Sally in his pet project, The Very Idea. Not only did Mr. LeBaron adapt the screenplay from a play he had written, but he also cast Hugh Trevor, his nephew, to play the male lead. Unfortunately, for all concerned, The Very Idea was a major flop. It hastened Mr. LeBaron's exit from the studio, as well as Sally's. Now, Loretta shared a memory about this time. Sally and I had the biggest fight we ever had. Now, in Pollyann and Sally's room, they had a chaise lounge. It was supposed to be what ladies reclined on, but it really wasn't very comfortable. So it was just in the room for looks. Sally and Paul used to keep a Spanish shawl draped over it. The shawl had a lot of fringe, and Sally liked keeping that fringe just so. So I came into the room and flopped down on the lounge, and the fringe went every which way. Sally grabbed me by the hand. She yelled, "Oh, I just finished straightening that fringe." Well, I was so surprised, and she was so mad, and then I got so mad. The situation escalated, and we literally started slapping each other. Now, Mama came in and said, all right, that's enough, you two. And as she separated us, then she separated us and said, all right, that's enough. You've got to settle down. Now, this is Sally. This is Loretta continuing her quote. That could have been what made her so mad. I don't really know what was behind it. Now, I don't know if Loretta was being a little disingenuous with this comment, because it would seem to me that it was pretty apparent what was behind Sally's ear, however you say that word, IRE. Everything had come so easy for Sally. She was the one who had been discovered by a studio, then rediscovered by another studio, and she was the great beauty of the family. Now she was working freelance. Simultaneously, Warner Brothers determined that the name Loretta Young could carry a movie, and they were making tons of money when Loretta was loaned out to other studios. And these loan outs really helped Loretta's career, because the studios were paying a lot of money to use her they wanted to put her in a higher level of films. So Loretta and Sally were clearly on different career tracks. And Sally remembered that the preferential treatment that Loretta had at the studio really continued at home. So, quoting Sally, when Loretta would go to Warner Brothers, she had a wardrobe woman, a hairdresser, and a makeup girl. They all ran errands for her, bringing her tea, coffee, whatever she wanted. Then she'd come home and she'd just say to Mom, "Oh, I'm tired." So my mother would go in and get hot cloths and put them on her eyes and then put on coat cloths, and she'd rub her feet. Mom was just always very, very close to Loretta. Now, I would go out and do a 5-day picture. I didn't have the hairdresser, any makeup woman, any of this. I did the same thing. I'd come home and say, "Oh, I'm tired." And Mom would say, "Well, go to bed, dear." So that was the difference. Sally was busy freelancing. She recalled, "I did 5 or 6 Zane Grey westerns with Randolph Scott. I remember Randy telling me, 'Sally, whenever they have a western that's coming up and they need a girl that everyone can stand to live with on location, they'd always say, well, let's get Sally Blaine. She's pretty, she's clean, and she looks like she's a good girl.'" Loretta remembered, "One night at the dinner table, I was crying about some part that I was scheduled to do, and I didn't think it was good enough. Sally was there, and finally she said, 'Oh, you just make me sick. I'd give my eye tooth for that part, and here you are crabbing about it.'" Meanwhile, Polly Ann was playing John Wayne or Buck Jones, leading lady in a series of westerns. Polly Ann barely remembered these days, and she recalled, "I couldn't tell you what any of those were about. You could make them in 10 days or 2 weeks. You just said your lines, and that was it." Alan Mulbray, an actor who was a good friend of mine, dubbed me Queen of Poverty Row because I was the leading lady in so many of those cheap pictures. They weren't all Westerns, some of them were whodunits. Just a suggestion, so that you get a little more idea of Sally and Polly Ann. Go on YouTube and put their names. Just say like Sally Blaine movies, Polly Ann Young movies, and pull 1 or 2 of them up and see what they looked like in those years and why they were leading ladies. Okay, Loretta set up Polly Ann. She was a beautiful girl, just beautiful. So naturally, they would use her in these parts. But Polly Ann really wasn't that hell-bent for a career. I can't imagine her arguing with the director about what she did or didn't want to do. I think for Polly Ann, making movies was just something to do. Loretta related a revealing story about herself and Polly Ann and how they viewed their prospective careers. We were both going to go to the Academy Awards, and both of us were having dresses made by Irene. Irene Sharoff was the costume designer who mainly freelanced from various studios, and she also had a shop at Bullock's Worcester. She was a wonderful designer. So Polly Ann and I, we went together for the fittings, and I kept telling Irene how I wanted my dress to look, whereas Polly Ann just stood there and the designer designed. The night of the Academy Awards, she was dressed before I was, and she came into my room. I said, "Oh, Paul, that dress looks just great." Then I put my dress on, and she said, "Loretta, it's awful." I looked in the mirror and said, "Oh, it isn't as bad as I think it is it?" She said, "Yes, it is." So she said, "Now, Loretta, it doesn't make any difference what I look like, but it does make a difference what you look like. So I'll wear that and you wear this." And she did, and I did. Paul thought it was important because they were going to be for much, much more than they would her. Loretta's next picture co-starred her with Jean Harlow. I don't know, maybe she was considered the original blonde bombshell. Anyway, Loretta was supposed to be the central character, but she reluctantly understood why it quickly became a Jean Harlow vehicle. More on that and podcast 56. So see you then.